Hello, and welcome to another short box from Warhammer 40k's Grim History from the Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and this week we'll be talking about the end of the founding of the Empire, which is called the Great Scouring. Now for the past weeks, we have covered the Second Founding, the Iron Cage, the Ecclesiarchy, and the death of Roboute Gilliman. But one thing we haven't covered is what the other First Founding Legions were doing. And this week, we will cover what the First Legions and their Primarchs actually did. Now, you gotta keep in mind, none of the Primarchs loved the idea of the Second Founding. Even Jagatai, who let his captains have more autonomy than the rest, had problems with it. For those other than the Khan, and we will get to him in a minute, didn't like it mainly because they were losing power over their legions. Yeah, we covered that. What is more important is what they were doing during the Great Scouring. Now, we don't need to cover the Imperial Fist because, well, we covered that last week with the Iron Cage. Now, the three legions that were nearly destroyed in Estevan V, the answer is pretty simple. They helped where they could, but their feats were small in the Great Scouring simply because they were simply not enough of them. Now, while the Salamanders and Raven Guard licked their wounds and repopulated, I find more interesting in what the Iron Hands did. Remember, out of the three, they lost their Primarch. Which reminds me, they were not the only ones to do so. The noble Blood Angels also were without a Primarch. So what did they do? Well, before I answer these two questions, let's briefly go through the ones still left with a father, shall we? The Space Wolves Legion with Leman Russ spearheaded the Scouring, continuing to wage war on the traitors for another 7 standard years, before the last rebel formations were destroyed or exiled to the isolated warp rift known as the Eye of Terror. As usual, Leman led his sons into the teeth of the enemy, forcing them back into the Eye. Enough said. While his brother Jagatai Khan is a completely different matter. Always estranged and overlooked as an outlier, the Great Khan simply disappeared. Let me explain, what I can at least. In order to contain the outlaws, renegades, and aliens that dwelled within the Maelstrom Warp Rift, and had taken advantage of the disruptions caused by the heresy to run amok in the Ultima Segmentum, Roboute Gilliman, now the Lord Commander of the Imperium, ordered the surrounding star systems to be reinforced. The White Scars were tasked with the main responsibility for securing the area from their homeworld. Following the calamitous events of the Horus Heresy, Jagatai Khan led the White Scars for 70 more Terran years, cleansing the Imperium of traitors and those aliens who sought to take advantage of humanity's time of weakness. The Imperium had been torn in two by Horus's rebellion, and no part of the Imperial space had escaped its ravages. The Yasan sector was no exception. It was there that the White Scars' homeworld of Chagoris lay. But when the Great Khan returned to rebuild his legion's strength after the devastating siege of Terra, he found only misery. Not all of the Yasan sector's scores of worlds had remained loyal, and in the anarchy of rebellion, the insidious Drukhari had seized the opportunity to raid and take slaves with wanton abandon. Thousands were cut down, thousands more enslaved, carried off through the secret passages of the webway to meet a fate no mortal human could possibly imagine. Yet, it was only thanks to the garrison left by Jagatai that Chagoris and some of its key production and recruitment worlds had fared better than the rest of the sector. But these forces had not been entirely adequate. The Drukhari had been able to seize Chagorian tribespeople as slaves. Jagatai applauded the garrison's warlike and independent spirit, but hatred for those who had taken his people burned in his heart. Replenishing his ranks, the Great Khan took the fight to the enemy, his campaign now one of vengeance. With the Great Khan at its head, the effort to reclaim the Asan sector met with early successes. Thanks to the foresight of Chagoris' garrison, the Yusan campaign's momentum was maintained with a steady supply of munitions, vehicles, and fresh warriors. It was at this point that the White Scars learned of the Codex Astartes, in which Roboute Gilliman stated that all the Space Marine legions should break their forces into 1,000 warrior chapters. Jagatai, who had long allowed his khans to operate semi-independently, was actually in favor of these reforms. The Codex would, for the most part, simply formalize the way in which the White Scars had operated since their inception, and the Khan of Khans saw only virtue in extending even greater freedom to his sons. Though it saddened him to see so many of his sons' armor no longer painted in his colors, the Great Khan knew that this was only for the better. The Yasan campaign was a time of renewed vigor for the Great Khan, or so it was said. His hunting grounds of old were filled with the remnants of those who had turned against the Imperium during the Horus Heresy, and he was once again able to indulge in the visceral thrill of new conquests and glorious victories, albeit tainted by the knowledge of the damage done by Horus's treachery. Yet his main enemy was the Drukhari. Like all the Eldari, they are a species of great and ancient intellect, and it appears that it was their intention that the Khan discover their plans as part of a wider scheme to capture and subject Jagatai and his sons to twisted experimentation. The source of the Drukhari raids was a large webway portal located in the depths of the dark, foreboding forest, too dense for the White Scars and their allies to fight from their metal steeds. This did not faze Jagatai. Revenge would be had. Honor demanded it. The Great Khan and his First Brotherhood held the center of the battle line, driving straight towards the portal. The rest of his forces secured the flanks, wary of potential ambush and ready to encircle the Drukhari Eldritch device. The White Scars and their allies were as a stick to a nest of stinging insects, and their attack's ferocity was met by a deadly ambush of dozens of bands of warriors, pain engines, and all matters of hideous Drukhari creations. Many poured from the hideaways concealed by Eldritch energy, and the Space Marines were beset on all sides. Scores of the Great Khan's sons died horrific, painful deaths. Others were captured, doomed to a worse fate, in the arenas of the dark city of Kamara. But the Warhawk kept on, determined to reach his quarry. The Drukhari Archon stood before the portal itself, directing his warriors with flicks of his sword. He was laughing, savoring every ounce of pain being inflicted and suffered across the battlefield. The smile did not leave his face, even as he observed the Great Khan racing towards him. Without any loss of composure, he simply directed more of his forces in Jagatai's direction, slowing Jagatai down and driving him to even greater anger. The Great Khan could not be halted, however. He pushed onwards, his First Brotherhood at his side, cutting down foe after foe with his sword. It is said that with his forces failing, the Archon moved to flee into the webway portal. Now, it cannot be known whether or not the Xenos desired to close it before Jagatai Khan raced through with the entirety of his Brotherhood. All that can be known is that as soon as the last White Scar crossed the threshold, the shimmering gateway collapsed. Thus, the Great Khan disappeared into the warp, never to be seen again. Yet the White Scars believe that he is still hunting and killing Drukhari in the warp, and when he is needed most, he will return to unite his sons. Now, next week we will go into the fatherless Primarchs. I know I said we would get into it now, but there isn't enough time to do justice to what happened to these two noble chapters. What I will leave you with is the Raven Guard, and more importantly, the sad story of Corvax. After Horus's defeat, Corax begrudgingly welcomed the decision to split the legions into chapters during the Second Founding, for he knew that Rabute Gilliman's vision for protecting the future of the Imperium was necessary. It was a future the Raven Guard would face alone, though. Corax disappeared, consumed by the tragic acts he had committed to save his sons. His ultimate fate reflected much of his life, was shadowed in mystery. Yet us chroniclers of the stars do so love the challenge of a mystery. So I delved into it a wee bit, and I will give you a brief understanding on what the Raven did after he disappeared. Well, to the extent of my knowledge. Unbeknownst to all within the Imperium, after his disappearance, Corax took up his prior role as the Emperor's justice, made manifest. He had resolved during his time in the Ravenspire to enter the Eye of Terror in pursuit of the traitor legions and hunt down his traitorous brother Primarchs. He began with the architect of the Imperium's ruin, Lorgar of the Word Bearers. Within the Eye of Terror, on the demon world of Sikaris, the world the Word Bearers had claimed for their own in the wake of the Great Scouring, the Dark Apostle Kulta Ar sought to raise a huge edifice to the glory of his gene father Lorgar and his dark gods, but his work was derailed when something began killing the Word Bearers under his command. His slaves told him that it was a shadow that rose up and tore the heretic Astartes to shreds. When the shadow finally came for Kulta Ar, he could not hope to fight it, so he took the Word Bearers' survivors and withdrew to Lorgar's sanctum, desperate for the Primarch's aid. The demon prince Lorgar that emerged was immensely different from the man Corax had bested on the killing fields of Esfon V. A golden-skinned giant, wrapped in a cloak of throbbing chaos runes, and holding a vicious spiked mail, Corax's prey now radiated power and and cruelty. Yet, Corax had changed as well. Constant exposure to the energies of the warp within the Eye of Terror had stripped away the mortal facade the Emperor had bestowed upon the Raven, and revealed the true warp form consciousness that lived beneath the surface of every Primarch. Now the humanoid creature of blades and living shadow that could transform into an enormous flock of ravens, that being that was Corax, hurled himself at Lorgar, trading immense blows that would have felled a space marine many times over. The two demigods battled back and forth across the massive temple to the ruinous powers. But as before, the Raven Guard gained the upper hand. Summoning a nimbus of power, Lorgar forced back his black-eyed tormentor and staggered into the Templum Inficio. At the tower in the heart of everything, Lorgar plunged into the hidden chamber and slammed the obsidian doors behind him. Screaming his rage and frustration, Corax swore to Lorgar that even if it took 1,000 years, he would hunt him down and tear him limb from limb. On the black door blocking the Raven Lord from his prey, 2 runes flared into being, spelled out with a simple message: deny fate. Did the Raven Lord crush the father of the ecclesiarchy? Well, unfortunately, that, my folks, is a story for another time. And that is where I leave you. Join us next week for the end of the Great Scouring, where we find out what happened to the 2 fatherless legions, the Iron Hands and the Blood Angels. If you enjoyed this Vox, please like, comment, subscribe, and follow. And like always, until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.